All right, I hope you had some great time learning about depth of field through the lecture that I did and then the other additional supplemental lectures and readings. We're talking about motion, which will bring us to shutter speed. So I found this great graphic to kind of visualize how your shutter speed works. Now, like I said in the first introductory video for the assignment is this one's going to be a little bit more complicated. Practice a simple motion. Maybe it's throwing a basketball or something that spins fast, like spinning the wheel on your bike and trying to freeze it. And just work with every single shutter speed you work with. Now again, there's shutter priority in your camera, which is sort of you set the shutter that you want. It's a semi-manual, semi-automatic mode. And then the camera makes adjustments. This can be fun to play around with, but remember, for shooting manual and we're emphasizing manual functions. We want to show that we are smarter and more capable than a camera. And of course, your camera tells me if it shoots auto, whether or not it is auto, shutter priority, program, or aperture priority, or if it's manual. So I know this. But this is a great little guide that I found on Pinterest of all places. This sort of lists how fast your shutter speed. Remember, this is in fractions of a second of what kind of shutter speed you need to be using. So when you're thinking about shooting, set the ISO the best you can. For this, you may have to push your ISO, especially for those faster shutter speeds, because we need more light if we're going to do a quick shutter speed. Typically, you're going to open up that aperture, make it as wide as you can do it. The depth of field is going to be secondary to the shutter speed. Keep that in mind when you're working. You want to pre-focus and plan for the motion before you start pulling out your camera. And we're going to really emphasize those extremes, so we don't want sort of subtle blur. We want to show that we can slow things down and speed things up. Long exposures, there should be a blow function, which is sort of however long your exposure is. I think at this one I did film, and how long that I pressed the shutter curtain so it would remain open, and when I released, it closed. So freezing motion is when you're using that really fast shutter speed. Your ISO is going to be a little higher, so that grain is something you may have to forgive. There's really no way around because that shutter speed has to be fast. And you want to show good motion, so water is great because you can see this beautiful arc of the water and the water droplets. Cars going fast at an intersection that doesn't look like they're parked. People jumping, which is really hard to do, to time both the shutter and people jumping. So think about that when you're thinking about freezing motion. If you look at this photograph, we're using a shallow depth of field because that background is not important because all the action is right here. I think the background's not important, so I don't need a deep depth of field. I can get more light when using that open aperture. Really wide, that number is going to be smaller. And then it's a pretty high ISO. There's a thing called panning with motion blur. When you're reading, we'll talk about it. And that's sort of when there's motion, but we're kind of emphasizing a subject that's in motion. So everything's kind of blurry, and this is kind of more in focus, kind of isolating it out. This is great for if you're really into sports. If you are a IndyCar or NASCAR or Formula One, I don't know the difference. But if you're a car racer, this is really going to be something you may have seen before. If you're into car racing, where the car seems to be in focus, but the background is blurred. This is a form of motion blur. So panning is where you move the camera during the exposure to follow the subject. Done properly, or when you get lucky, the subject is relatively sharp, not super, but relatively. And while the background's blur, it conveys a sense of motion. So this isn't the only way to do motion blur, but it's a common way. And I wanted to talk about it. It's best at slower shutter speeds around f1/8 of a second and 1/30th of a second. If possible, get your exposure set up before you attempt to pan. Think about the light that you can, and you kind of follow along. You do not have to do this for motion blur, but it might be fun to play around with. You'll read about it a little bit in some of the readings. So when you're working with motion blur, that's when your shutter speed is really slow. Typically, your camera's shutter speed, as long as you can handhold it without a camera shake, is usually the length of the lens. I usually say about 1 to 25, but if you're using a 50mm lens, you could probably go to 1/60th of a second. I still personally do not like to go slower than 1/25. Now, if you're not a steady person, maybe that number is a little quicker of a second fraction. Camera shake, to recognize it, is kind of when there's nothing that's in focus. So these are all examples of camera shake. We'll look at stuff that's in motion blur. But in motion blur, there's something that's really tying us around. Camera shake, you kind of have this ghosting part of the camera where there's movement. It's not from the subject, but it's really from the photographer, and the shutter's being too slow. To combat this, a tripod is really important. It's not a requirement for this class, but if you have a tripod, definitely use it. It's going to have that stability, and you can use those slower shutter speeds without having camera shake. I also like to recommend if you have a remote shutter, some with the newer cameras, you can do a shutter off your phone, which is really cool. They have wireless access. But if you do a self-timer, then the camera will have the long exposure. Oftentimes when we release the shutter in our camera, click the button, it gives an extra sense of camera shake. It's very subtle, but it's there. So that way you want to kind of have the camera take the exposure when you're not there. Make sure it's steady. You may have noticed some photographers will put sandbags to kind of give stability to their camera, especially if it's on a windy day like we had this past weekend. If you don't have a tripod, there's other ways around it. You can just simply try to create a steady surface. So shooting off a table is really great. Sometimes you have to stack some books up, but something that's a very steady surface. Top of your car may not be so steady, but inside of a room on top of some books, again, using that remote shutter or the self-timer really is going to help, and then you can play around with motion. We're going to look at some motion blur examples. So these are really great ones. We had this woman sitting behind a truck with this speed, and you can see her hair moving. It's not frozen. You could see it's kind of more of a panning effect, where she's seemingly in focus, but the background is in blur, and you can see her hair kind of softly flowing around. So we have sort of this long exposure of these fire sparks that are just kind of trailing up. This is great if you're really into that long exposure photography. So if you like night photography or those lights trailing, this could be really fun. Francesca Woodman does self-portraiture, and she's really into, this is on film, and I think she has a documentary on Netflix or PBS. But she uses her body to have this movement. This takes a lot of practice to figure out how to get these gorgeous movements, but she's working with a tripod. Here's another one of her pieces. And it's really great because you kind of get the dual image of what's happening with her on top of the mirror and then her figure. So this is almost even more steady than her as the figure. It's a soft ghostiness around this steady frame, which is really gorgeous. Again, like I said, night photography, so it's setting up on a tripod. This is again where you allow more time to get all that light in. You can take your ISO down a little if you have a longer exposure. The depth of field's pretty deep, but we have this movement here. And there's something really great about this sort of roundness of movement in the still of this photograph. We have the water, great for this assignment. So we have this movement of water where the figures are moving, and there's great contrast here. The juxtaposition between the still figure and the moving figure is really nice. And then there's the fire back there. There's a lot of questions I have about this photograph, which is really great. Motion blur student examples, not a ton, but really slowing that shutter speed to get the milkiness of the water or the trailing of the lights or the movement. There's this stillness, but this gorgeous movement. Freezing motion examples. So if you're into sports, this is up your alley. So skateboarding culture has always been working with photography. So we had this great freezing action, this backlit image, which is really gorgeous from this peak of the sun and the figure here. And you want to show that you are really emphasizing the movement. For someone to hold their bike up like that, it's going to be very difficult. Now this is gorgeous. Now this took me a few seconds to think about whether or not this actually was a strong image, but this is a movement where everyone's dancing and having a good time, and everyone's fairly still. This is almost like a gorgeous Renaissance painting of the stillness and the light and the action of how frozen in time this is. It's really gorgeous. Same photographer, but we have this horse up, kind of frozen in action. There is some movement, but primarily this figure is frozen in action. So using that quick shutter speed. I know we don't really deal with snow, but snow really reflects light off, which is great because those dreary days do not give us a lot of sunlight in the winter. This is a really powerful image. I really recommend you look at this photographer's work about water crisis. But we have these driplets of water frozen. I really emphasize the lack of water in one single image. So here's some just real quick freezing motion examples. Water. Water is great to play around with freezing motion. So I want you to kind of think about images you've seen in the past, how you can really creatively use this. It might be really fun to see a juxtaposition of sort of the same scene with frozen and blurred motion, where they're very different and they tell different parts of a story. And think about how something can be very different, whether it's frozen or motion blur. I really hope you have fun, and definitely read the readings and watch the videos before you get started shooting. Good luck.